Hanukkah. So we'll have Hanukkah and then Purim, and that will be the end of our study on the feast days. Which brings us to a question. Okay, so let me talk about this real quick, because I know some of our regulars can't be here today and they're probably listening to the live stream. And excuse me if I clear my throat a little bit extra in the mic today. I've got something going on in there today, so I apologize ahead of time. I'll try not to do it too much, but if I do, forgive me on the recording especially. Next week we'll do Purim. The following week I won't be here, so we won't have class on the 1st of June. Okay, there won't be any class on the 1st of June. Okay, so that's 2 weeks from today. Then when we start back up on the 8th of June, question is, what do we want to study? Some ideas. I turned it off so I could cough. Roger's saying, I can't hear you. I have some ideas, and I'll throw these out to you. We can talk about it next week, something for you to think about. One idea is to go through the book of John, discuss the book of John, kind of get out of the Old Testament history stuff and get into something a little more New Testament-ish. Another option that I thought of would be to take and do a study in the book of John, but not the entire book of John, but take the section of John, the few chapters that are there at the Passover supper when Jesus sits down at the Last Supper with the disciples, and then has the 4 chapters or so of just dedicated conversation with them sitting there at the table after the supper, which are some of the most common, most used scripture that we have, that we use for daily Christian life, Christian living, so on and so forth, that are contained in those 4 chapters or so. So those are a couple of things that I've been thinking about, a couple of options. So you guys can mull that around in your heads. Another option is that we could talk about the humanity of Christ on the cross. I kind of touched on that a little bit on Mother's Day, okay, with the third statement of Christ from the cross when he talks about his mother, and it pulled out the humanity of that particular thing. There are 7 statements he makes on the cross. We could talk about something like that and his humanity on the cross, bringing that out, the mixture of his humanity and deity. So those are 3 ideas to throw out there. If we do the entire book of John, I will not spend as much time in those 4 chapters, obviously, because we're going to be trying to get through an entire book of the Bible, as opposed to concentrating on those chapters. So keep that in your mind, and we'll take ideas next week, okay? All right, page 107, Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication. Hanukkah, or the Feast of Dedication, stands out among the celebrations of the Bible. Anybody understand why it stands out? Don't read any further. Why does it stand out? From all those other things we've been talking about, why would Hanukkah stand out? See, I said stop reading. See, just cheating right there. She just, that's Daisy cheating, by the way, for anybody who can't tell. Yes, it's because, she says, Pastor, don't throw me under the bus. It's because it's not mentioned as a feast in Leviticus 23. Okay? So all of the feasts that we've been talking about have been mentioned in Leviticus 23 as God ordaining them as feasts. This is different. Okay? So this particular feast day is different. So reading on, this is because it does not appear in the feast of the Lord in Leviticus 23, which Daisy so aptly read already. Despite the fact that Hanukkah is not spoken of by Moses, we should not assume that it is therefore non-biblical. As we shall see, it is indeed mentioned in later scriptural passages. To fully understand this holy day, we need to go back to a tumultuous time in the history of Israel, the Hellenistic period around 167 BCE. Now, this particular lesson, by the way, is going to be really historical. This is going to be a history lesson, mostly in understanding Hanukkah, because that builds the Feast of Dedications and how it happens. You'll find out. The question was, why wasn't it mentioned in Leviticus 23? You'll find out as we go through here, okay? Because it hadn't happened yet. That's the easy answer. Hanukkah has not happened yet. So you'll get that in just a second, okay? Because we're talking about, this goes back to what he said was a tumultuous time about 167 BCE. So this is still before Christ, okay? So we're still BCE. But if we're BCE, if we're at 167, where are we in history in the Bible? These are easy. Okay, these are easy questions. Do your math. If BC is before Christ, okay? We'll take the easy explanation as this, okay? BC is before Christ. So if we're at 167 BC, what chapter of the Bible are we in, or what book of the Bible are we in? Who? No, we're not in any book of the Bible because there's a 400-year period between Malachi and Matthew. It is. Do the math. All of my wonderful Bible scholars in here, especially my Bible students, should know that anything from 400 to 0 BC would really not be in a book of the Bible, because there is the quiet period, okay, what you call the quiet period here, that happens where there is no specific writing that has been canonized into the modern Bible. Doesn't mean there were no writings, doesn't mean there wasn't any activity, doesn't mean the world went to sleep for 400 years, because it didn't, and we're going to talk about that right now. There is a tremendous amount of things going on in the world. One of the greatest empires ever is coming to power in this particular time. Okay, so let's read on and we'll get it here. As was so often the case, the Jewish people were living under the oppression of a foreign power. A few generations earlier, the Greeks had come to world power under the remarkable leadership of Alexander the Great. With the ascension of this kingdom, Alexander seemed to have unified the ancient world into one common government and culture called Hellenism. So now let's stop there. Does that word, is that familiar? Is Hellenism familiar? No. You're killing me. Have we not ever talked about Hellenistic Jews? Okay. All stemming from Hellenism, stemming from a Greek goddess that was established by the culture and society of the Greeks. So the bleed over into the New Testament is from the Hellenistic society of the Greeks. Even though the Romans now have come to power, the Roman Empire is still fairly young. Okay? The Roman Empire is still fairly young in its takeover from the Greeks, and is still, by the way, in the first century, is still conquering the known world. They're still moving around conquering the known world. It's not 100% done and effective yet. So what happens is, as Rome comes in, let's take Judea, okay? They conquer Judea, they take Judea, but what happens is the influence from the last couple of hundred years is still in Judea. And that is the Hellenistic influence of Greek society. So that's why we talk about writing in Greek, Koine Greek, so that all of those who this gospel was being spread out to around the known world in this area would be able to understand it, because the common language of the day was Koine Greek. Okay, that was the common man language. That is not to say that the New Testament was written in Greek. Okay, that is a theological argument. Okay, I am on a particular side of that fence, but I know a lot of people who are on a different side of the fence. Okay, so let's talk about my side of the fence, because it's the only one that matters. My side of the fence is that we have several Hebrew men who were educated Hebrew men. Even the one that everybody talks about being stupid, Peter, being just common, regular, ignorant old Peter. Peter was not ignorant. Peter was educated. Peter understood. Peter's profession was a fisherman. Peter was loudmouthed. Peter was boisterous. Peter spoke before he thought. I know a lot of CEOs of companies that act that way. Okay? We have had a president that acted just like that. And he is by no matter what you think about that man, he is by no means stupid. So I'm just telling you, it's not about him being ignorant. It was just about him being a boisterous guy. But all of these men were educated men. They could write, they could read. In those days, you had to be educated to be able to read and write. It wasn't like there was public school for you to go to. It wasn't like everybody was forced to go to school, right? Nowadays, see, once again, you can't think of the Bible like you think about your 21st century life, or some of you your 19th century life, or wherever it was you came up in, okay? Masters, wherever you were born, it still is different today. I mean, up until, I don't know if anybody here is old enough to remember a time in this country when going to public school wasn't mandatory. And I don't know exactly when that came into law, where going to public school is mandatory, but I would imagine that even in, maybe as a generation before you guys, but it wasn't mandatory. And in a lot of parts of the country, even if they wanted you to do it, kids didn't go to school very long. They maybe go to a few years, and then they'd stay home and help the families, right? So this is a very different lifestyle. Nobody was being forced to go to school. In fact, most of the time you had to have money and have a wealthy family to get to go to school and get any kind of education. So it's a very different life, extremely different life that they lived at that particular time. So any of these guys who could read and write were educated men. They were educated men. So don't think that these disciples, because they were fishermen or because anything else, were dumb or uneducated. They had to be educated to do what they were doing. All right? So let me just take that little misnomer. So this was a different lifestyle. And so in this process, all of these people were doing this, but they were doing it from the Hellenistic society. Hellenistic society. All right? Okay, top of page 108. After Alexander's untimely death, there was a political scramble among the four generals, resulting in the division of the Hellenistic Empire. The Ptolemies took control of the south, which included Egypt. The Seleucids took charge of the northern area around Syria. This left Judea caught in the middle of a tug-of-war, wondering what the outcome would be. Eventually, the Seleucid Syrians, under the leadership of Antiochus IV, gained power and sought control of the new provinces. Seeking to unify his holdings, Antiochus enforced a policy of assimilation into the prevailing Hellenistic culture. Irrespective of the culture and beliefs of the captured peoples, the Seleucids required submission to the Greek way of life. So in this transfer of power, where you had a Greek rule over the world that left, in many cases, left openings for different cultures and different races to have their own belief systems and things of that nature. When these guys took over, they weren't going to have any of that. They required full assimilation to Hellenistic society, which would mean believing in Greek gods, worshiping Greek gods, putting aside whatever religious and moral and ethical beliefs you had, and submitting those to the Hellenistic way of life. The Greeks thought that to be truly effective, this assimilation must apply to all aspects of life, including language, arts, and even religion. Everything was to conform to the superior Greek way of life and values. So not surprisingly, this Hellenization policy did not present a major problem for many people under the Seleucids. Indeed, the Greeks were highly respected for their culture. Even many Jews in Judea had converted to the Hellenistic way and openly advocated adherence to it. However, there were a significant number of traditional Jews who were appalled at the changes in their society. Antiochus and the Seleucids continued growing more hostile towards these stubborn Jews who did not convert to Hellenism, and steps were taken to enforce their policy. Eventually, an ultimatum was given. Either the Jewish community must give up its distinctive customs, Shabbat, kosher law, circumcision, etc., or die. To prove his point, Antiochus marched his troops into Jerusalem and desecrated the holy temple. The altars, the utensils, even the golden menorah lampstand were all defiled and tore down. But that was just the start. Antiochus ordered that a pig be sacrificed on the holy altar and erected an image of the Greek god Zeus as the new point of worship in the temple. Antiochus insisted on being called Epiphanes, which means God manifest, enough to repulse any religious Jew. The Jewish community soon came up with an appropriate reflection of their feelings. Instead of calling him Antiochus Epiphanes, they made a play on words and called him Epimanes, which means crazy man. This brutal attack on the Jewish people and their faith would not go unanswered for long. The murmurings of revolt were heard in Judea and were crystallized in a small village called Modein. Syrian troops entered this town to enforce their assimilation policy. The soldiers planned to erect a temporary altar to the false gods and force the populace to participate in their religious ceremony, the highlight of which was eating the flesh of swine. So before we get past this, understand, Antiochus comes in and he defiles the temple. Okay? We hear about this quite often, but he defiles the temple. So much so that he takes it to the ultimate heresy, the ultimate defilement by bringing a pig and slaughtering it on the altar of God. The most unholy, vile thing that could be done. And then he erects a statue of Zeus in the temple. Okay? So now the Syrian army comes in, the Seleucid Syrian army comes in, and they are going to put down this rebellion in Modein, and they are going to cause everyone here not only to slaughter and worship, but now they must also eat the flesh of swine. What's wrong with Chicho on this? The Mexicans just pipe right up. Excuse me, Puerto Ricans. Just pipe right up. So here you see the absolute abomination before God and requiring his people to come to this complete defilement, not just defilement of the temple, but defilement of their bodies as well. Okay? All right. So the next paragraph says, living in this village was an old godly priest named Mattathias and his 5 sons. When the Seleucid soldiers chose him to lead the pagan ceremony, Mattathias and his sons reacted with holy indignation. Enough was enough. They killed the soldiers and started a revolt against the oppressors. One of the sons, Judah, rose to leadership and was nicknamed Maccabee, or the Hammer. Story starting to sound familiar now? Okay. Overwhelmingly outnumbered and undersupplied, the armies of the Maccabees turned to more creative devices. Relying on their own knowledge of the hill country and employing guerrilla warfare, the Jewish forces met with surprising success. Spurred on by their firm conviction that the God of Israel was true and faithful, the Maccabees proved that the impossible could happen. In the Hebrew month Kislev, right around December, they drove out the Syrians and recaptured the temple in Jerusalem. So this is one of the greatest guerrilla warfare wars in the history of mankind. One of the greatest outnumbered little armies against one of the greatest forces in the history of the world. And they conquer them. They take back Jerusalem. And this is a huge battle, and it happens. They faced the sober task of restoring the temple to true worship of God. The temple compound was in shambles, desecrated by idolatry of the Syrians. The Maccabees and their followers quickly cleansed the altars and restored the holy furnishings. Now, in this cleansing, it wasn't just going and wipe everything down with a Clorox wipe or a Lysol wipe. They literally had to take out, scour, cleanse the stones that were in the floor. They had to remove them because the blood of the pig had soaked down into them or had soaked down into the cracks between the stones. They had to remove them and place, as you read in the Bible, new lively stones that had to be placed back into the temple. Okay, new stones had to be placed. So it was a huge undertaking. This temple was an incredible building. Remember, we're not talking about the tabernacle in the wilderness here. We're talking about an incredible building. Okay, so it was a major undertaking. But the religious conviction of these people required that it be done, and it be done now, because this was the center of their worship. This is something that is absolutely lost on modern day religion. The zeal for coming to a place to worship God has died tremendously. The zeal for the reverence of the house of God has died tremendously. So many things you could say about this, but we don't see this kind of dedication, this kind of zealousness toward doing things of this nature for God. We see the zealousness to what God does for us and our complete, what term do I want to use here? Our complete lack of any responsibility to do anything for God or toward God. It seems like we just hear that constantly. And all these people could think about is, how can we rebuild this so we have a place to go to worship God? How can we reestablish our relationship with God? Okay? It was all they could think of to do. And they attack it immediately. Bottom paragraph there says, of a particular importance to them was the broken menorah, symbolizing the light of God. They restored it and attempted to light it, but there was a problem. Jewish tradition recounts that as they searched for some specially prepared oil, they found only enough to burn for one day. The priests knew that it would take at least 8 days for new oil to be produced, so what would they do? Not only did the oil have to be produced, they had to send the priest out to get it, 4 days away, 4 days back. It would take that long for them to be able to do it. And they only had 1 day's worth of oil in the stores there that had not been defiled. Okay? They decided it was better to light the menorah anyway. At least the light of God would shine forth immediately. To their amazement, the oil burned not only for 1 day, but for 8 days until the additional oil became available. The temple was restored and rededicated to the glory of the God of Israel, and an 8-day festival was established. It is called Hanukkah, Hebrew for dedication. Every year, starting on the 25th of Kislev, the Jewish community recalls the twofold miracle, the miracle of the oil as well as the miracle of the miraculous military victory. Okay? So that's Hanukkah in a nutshell. Okay? It's to celebrate the military victory and the miracle of the oil, and it is a feast of dedication because it all came about from them dedicating the new temple back to God. Okay? So this is the terminology and the reasoning behind it. And this 8 day, and we'll talk a little bit more about the number of the candlesticks on the menorah and stuff in just a minute, but I just want to make sure everybody understands it's twofold. Military victory, so God showing his might, and number two, God showing his suppliance for us and his fullness for us in keeping that oil lit for 8 days when there was only enough for one. Menorah. Absolutely, yeah. So the question was, does the idea of keeping that lampstand lit go back to the original directions for the tabernacle and temple of always having that light going? Yes, that light was never to go out. So what they had was, it's an interesting thing because they could have put off the dedication of the temple for 8 days when they had all the oil, right? Or for 7 days. They could have just put it off. But it was a lot of people hate the word religious, and it's because of what people have done with it. But at that particular time, the religiosity of this was very pure. Okay? It was something very pure. And it meant something to them, these symbols of God, God's light, and God's presence were so important to them that they said, even if this burns out, let's light it right now and get it lit up so people can see right now that we have got what God promised us, that God abides with us again. Let's do it now, period. What was that? Faith in action. Now, I'm on the fence about this. I've heard people teach us that they had faith that God would keep it lit. I really have never read that in accounts of the situation, okay? I've never really read that. I know that it's been, to me, it seems like it's been introduced into it, and it would make perfect sense, okay? I'm not arguing the point. So they could have had faith that it was going to happen. I've never read that, but either way, I would applaud whether they had faith that it would stay lit or they just wanted the presence of God right now. Even if I only get the presence of God for one day, I want it now. And that's what it symbolized to them. So their zeal for God was so much that I'll take what I can get, but I want it now. I don't want to wait. That's pretty amazing. Is that how we approach God? I don't care what it takes. I'm just going to go get God. And you know what? You can make fun of me. You can laugh at me. You can say I'm going to burn out. I don't care what you say. I just want to get to God. I just want that to be my goal. I don't care what you think. I don't care what's going on. I just want the zeal in my heart to be to get to God, and I don't want that to die out. So I'm going to do what I need to do to get to God. It's pretty cool. It's pretty admirable. So I think that us being able to see this example of the why to doing it, even if that's the only why. Hey, it's great if they had faith. Don't worry about it. Light it. God will keep it lit. Whatever it was. But they didn't want to wait. We want that relationship. We want that intimacy with God right now. And we'll do what we're supposed to do on the backside of it, but let's light it. Let's get it consecrated right now. Let's dedicate the temple or our lives, however you want to term it and look at it, to God and get it dealt with. Okay? So, where did I leave off at here? Some people question our inclusion of Hanukkah in the biblical holy days. It is not mentioned in the Feast of Leviticus 23. However, the Tanakh, or the Older Testament, reveals that Hanukkah is clearly predicted in later prophetic writings. The vision was given to the prophet Daniel in an amazingly detailed description of the events surrounding Hanukkah. As he describes the coming kingdoms that would have impact on Israel, Daniel writes this in Daniel 8. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king. The four horns that replace the one that was broken off represent four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. So if we're discussing Alexander the Great's kingdom, the first horn, and when the first horn is broken off in Daniel's vision, we see that four more replace it, which were the four generals that that Alexander had, and they replace him, except they're not as powerful as he was. So Daniel is prophesying about this some hundreds of years before it actually happens. Okay? And it's very detailed and very descriptive, very accurate. This is a graphic description of the rise of the Hellenistic Empire, with its strong central leader, which is the large horn, Alexander the Great, was indeed broken by his death. His four generals, the four horns, split the kingdom between themselves, yet they were even more specific details that were given by Daniel. He writes later on in the next few verses, in the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a stern-faced king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy mighty men and the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. So according to the word given by Daniel, the focal point of this Hellenistic kingdom would be a leader who, by a power not of his own, would persecute the Jewish people. He would magnify himself through his brutal attacks and words, and as was the case with Antiochus, who called himself Epiphanes. Yet God promised this evil ruler would be broken without human agency. The fanatical persecution by the Seleucids is predicted along with a miraculous deliverance by God. The miracle of Hanukkah is mentioned in the Hebrew Scriptures with such detail that some liberal scholars have suggested that Daniel was writing after the fact and not prophetically, which you can see the reference there. What an important time of history to understand. What a great celebration Hanukkah should be. Now, we absolutely don't subscribe to the fact that Daniel wrote this after the Maccabees, because that doesn't work out with any kind of historical timeline, any chronology of any history at all. It would have to have been written and stuck into Daniel. We believe that Daniel did have this great vision, and not only was he speaking of this particular time, but he was also speaking of a time to come in the Antichrist, which we typically talk about this more in the light of. But it was a great foresight of what would happen with the demise of the Greek Empire and the rise of these four generals, one of being Antiochus Epiphanes, who thought he was close to God, and was the most vicious of all of those generals that came out of there. Okay, so this is kind of a history of how Hanukkah comes into being. Okay, and so the story of the Maccabees, this son of Mattathias, who was a priest, Judah, who gains the name Maccabee because of his strong hand in dealing with the attackers or the invaders. They call him the Hammer, or Maccabee. And he raises an army that was called the Maccabees, and they destroy and conquer and push this army back to Syria. They kick them out of Judea, push them back to Syria, and they take over Jerusalem again. It's an incredible military happening, the likes of which are few and far between in history at all. It's an incredible thing. So God, once again, favors his people in battle and causes them to win something that they absolutely should not have won. So it could not have been by human agency. It had to be divine. Right? So God once again gives a victory to those who don't deserve victory. Okay. So let's move on. Let's talk about the traditional Jewish observance of Hanukkah. Hanukkah is an enjoyable holy day with many meaningful customs. Every year, starting on the 25th of Kislev, the Jewish community begins its 8-day celebration. The holy day focuses on the Hanukkah, the 9-branched Hanukkah menorah. The usual menorah, like the modern symbol of the state of Israel, is 7-branched. 8 branches remind us of the 8 days' miracles of the oil, and the appropriate number of candles are kindled each day. The 9th branch in the center, with the 4 branches on either side, stands out. It is used to light the other candles, and it is called the shamash, or in Hebrew it means servant. The menorah is lit after dark, usually in connection with the festival meal. So let me stop there and let's talk about this, the menorahs a little bit. I'm not as interested in all of the observances here as I am about talking about this, because to me this is the most important part. We will hear different, if you read on through here, you're going to see New Testament observances of Hanukkah. There are things that happen that you can see. But let's talk about the menorah. Okay, the menorah is the lampstand. All right, in the tabernacle, the menorah is what? What does it look like? It's got all the blossoms, the almonds. It comes out, goes up, and goes around, right? Like that. Is that it? So what's the difference between the Hanukkah and the menorah in the temple? 7 versus 9 branches, okay? So the difference being the menorah that's in the temple, or the tabernacle in the beginning that God designs, is a center with 3 on each side. Okay, so totaling 7. The Hanukkah is a center with 4 on each side. The 4 on each side in the Hanukkah represent the 8 days of the miracle of the oil, right? That's why they made a different one and called it a Hanukkah as opposed to the menorah that stands in the temple. Now, the similarities between these two is mainly one, and the one is the center, the shamash, okay? The servant candle, or the servant lamp. All right? And we talked about this in detail when we were talking about the construction of the tabernacle, right? Talked about it quite a bit. In the construction of the tabernacle, we talked about all of the Christology and the symbolism of Christ. It was in there. But in both of these things, Christ is at the center of all things that happen. And everything that comes out of there, it's Christ's light that lights everything else. Right? So it's always the servant candle. So whenever the lighting of the candles happens, it's always the center candle lit first. And the light from the center candle is used to light all of the others. So in a Hanukkah service, in the temple, wherever it would be, in a synagogue, whatever they were going to do, if there was a priest or a rabbi or whoever was going to come light candles, they would light that center candle first, blow out the match, and then use the center candle to light the others. So every night of Hanukkah, that center candle is removed to light one more of the candles. Because it's always the light of Christ that provides light. It's never the outer candles that provide light to the center. It's always the center candle that provides light to the outside. Okay? That is the rule and the way of things with God. There's no getting around that. People like to interject that they know more, or they know how to do it, or whatever. It's always Christ. Always Christ. There's no one else who knows anything outside of Christ. Outside of him, we are nothing. We have nothing. Our own wisdom is ignorance. It's folly before God. It all comes from him. So the most important thing that we can see, whether it's a Hanukkah or it's a menorah from the temple, is that servant candle. And it's called the shamash, or the servant candle, for a purpose. Because Christ and his sacrifice and who he is always came to serve his children. He has all the titles. All the titles. King, priest, prophet, rabbi, teacher, all the things, right? And yet the most important title that he has, and the title that he uses and utilizes the most, is always servant. And this is what happens here. When Jesus comes in, and if we read back into here, we'll find out, and I want to flip over to the next page, page 113, Hanukkah in the New Testament. Page 113, Hanukkah in the New Testament, at the top is John, the 10th chapter. Then came Hanukkah in Jerusalem. It was winter, and Yeshua was walking around inside the temple area in Shlomo's colonnade. Hanukkah is a beautiful holy day celebrated by Jewish people. Many are aware of the customs and the history of Hanukkah. Perhaps some even know the scriptures well enough to know that this holy day is prophetically mentioned in the book of Daniel. Most surprising to both Jew and the Christian communities is that the most clear mention of Hanukkah in the Bible is in the New Testament. The people who normally celebrate this holy day, the Jewish people, have scant biblical references for it. Yet, the people who do not normally celebrate Hanukkah have the most explicit references to it in the New Testament. This brings us to the first reason believers in Messiah might want to understand and celebrate this holy day. The Messiah celebrated it. Not only did Yeshua celebrate Hanukkah, but he observed it in the same temple that had been cleansed and rededicated just a few generations earlier under the Maccabees. Many Jewish scholars see a deeper spiritual meaning to Hanukkah. As the editors of the popular Art Scroll Masorah series state, then the light is kindled to give inspiration, for the light of the Messiah must burn brightly in our hearts. So the whole centering of it is still the light of the Messiah. Even if the Jew does not accept Yeshua as the Messiah, that servant candle still represents Messiah to them. And it still is celebrated in that particular way. We as Christians, we as believers, know that it is Jesus. It is Yeshua as that center. Yeah. Do you mean in synagogues? All the above. So the question is, do they observe it just in the temple, or do they observe it in homes? Absolutely in homes. around. If you read the rest of that section on the Jewish observances, you'll find that they do it in homes and in the temple, both. In homes especially, and now modern Judaism, I say modern, but for a long, long time, they give gifts every one of the 8 nights to the children. They'll have gifts for them. Mainly came about to offset Christmas and the gift-giving part of it, as opposed to just celebrating. Normally it was just celebration, dinners, joy, all those things, because they were remembering the military victory and the miracle of the oil. So it was God, supplying and delivering them once again. So it's a celebration time for them. But and it's been over the last 2 or 3 centuries that they really got into this heavily about the gift giving. So the gift giving has evolved, so to speak, in it. But it always has been a huge celebration. So they do it in synagogues and in homes, especially in homes. Synagogues, they usually have more of a first night of Hanukkah service and a last night of Hanukkah service. That'll be more of what they would do in the synagogues. But a lot of synagogues will have an every night lighting. In fact, most synagogues have an every night lighting ceremony. They might not have a full service or a full celebration, but they will have some kind of a lighting ceremony for when they light the next candle or the next lamp that would go on. Answer your question? Well, the question is, what's the difference between doing it in the temple or the synagogue and doing it at home? And this goes for Shabbat or for a feast day, okay, like Hanukkah. Okay, so the difference is a public display or a personal, intimate display at home. The homes were all they were required. I mean, I was going to stop short of saying required, but they were required because of their dedication to God on a personal level to do these things. They would also go in and do them corporately, being called together to worship corporately, okay? But in homes, it was always done because it's a personal relationship with God. It brings the relationship with God to a personal level. Originally, it was just dictated as a tabernacle issue, right? In the beginning, all of this was only done in the tabernacle. The only thing that was really done at home was feast meals and things of that nature, but all of the candle lightings, all those things were done in tabernacle only. Okay? That branched out, especially with the coming of Messiah, okay, to those who would be enlightened to the fullness of the Messiah, but it branched out as it became as Jews were spread out across the world, it became increasingly difficult to find synagogues, you couldn't get to the temple itself, things of that nature, that they had this worship in the home as well. Okay, so it later becomes more of a personal requirement because you need to have that in your home as well, because you can't always get to the place you need to go to for a synagogue. Okay, there were rules about Shabbat, how far you could walk, how far you could travel, what you could do, and if you lived too far from a synagogue to be able to walk a Sabbath's walk, what do? You either the day before travel to get there and be there and stay there, or you have to have methods of worship in the home. So all of these things are accounted for and allowed for by God and brought in. So it's both. It's done both in both areas. Okay. This is a logical conclusion. The next paragraph here. Hanukkah is a celebration of deliverance. It has also become a time to express messianic hope. Just as the Maccabees were used by God to redeem Israel, perhaps the greatest redeemer, the Messiah, not perhaps, but the greatest redeemer, that's a terrible statement, the Messiah would also come at this time. With this understanding, we more fully appreciate scenes that have unfolded as Yeshua celebrated the feast 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem. Amidst the festivities, Yeshua was approached by some rabbis who asked a simple question. How much longer are you going to keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us publicly. John 10:24. The answer to this very appropriate question is contained in Yeshua's Hanukkah message, which he clearly reiterates his claim to the and the proofs of messiahship in John 10:25 through 39. This shows a real connection between Hanukkah and Christmas. Hanukkah recalls the military victory for Israel, and the implications are vast. If Antiochus had succeeded in his campaign of anti-Semitism and destruction, there would have been no Jews by the time Yeshua came. The miracle of Christmas could only take place after the miracle of Hanukkah. Certainly all believers in Yeshua have important reasons to remember this feast of dedication. Messiah, our deliverer, has come. Okay? So, once again, whether you are going to practice Hanukkah or not, you need to understand, without Hanukkah, the Jewish people are either decimated or completely assimilated. Okay? Everybody understand that terminology well enough? Okay. I want to make sure there's no questions about that. So they're either annihilated, right? It either goes through this carnage and wipes them off the face of the earth, kills all of those who will not participate in the Hellenistic practices, or they're assimilated into and they lose their Jewishness. They lose their heritage and their relationship with God through their heritage. Either way, Judaism is gone, right? So this was another avenue that God used to preserve his people so Messiah could come. So once again, this Feast of Dedication that happens because of this victory and the miracle of the lamps and the oil becomes hugely important to Messiah appearing on the scene. So it all plays into this. So during the quiet period, the 400-year period between Malachi and Matthew, we find that there was no quietness going on at all. The world was being conquered by one of the greatest kingdoms and world powers that's ever been known. One of the greatest military minds, very, very young, but great military mind, great conqueror. And in his very untimely death, all of a sudden you have this incredible powerhouse around the world that's conquered the known world, the civilized world, and all of a sudden it's split into four, and you have really bad dudes taking over the four kingdoms, fighting each other for those four kingdoms. And the worst of the worst just happens to be the guy that gets Judea, that wins Judea. The atrocities of Antiochus Epiphanes are legendary. The things he would do, just the fact that he would take and study Judaism enough to know the abomination that the swine blood in the temple would be, right? And it is such a purposeful attack on the religion to show their superiority. So he does this, and he utilizes this so that he can just completely devastate, decimate the will of the people, right? Just destroy them, right? Because if you do this, you've destroyed the most holy thing that they have. There's nothing above the temple. There's nothing above the place where God dwelled. Now you have destroyed it. You've desecrated all of the furnishings of it. And now you have desecrated it by having pig's blood up on the altar of God. There is no greater insult to the people and to the God of Israel than what Antiochus Epiphanes did. They could have gone in and had sex on the altar, and it would not have been the same insult to God. Okay? So that the absolute uncleanness of what he did was devastating. So he does this in order to show his power, in order to show his influence, and in order to put the fear of Antiochus Epiphanes into the people. Right? Instead, he forgot who he was dealing with. And one of the things you're going to find out throughout history about not just the Jews, but Middle Easterners in general, whether they're Muslim or Jew or anybody from that region of the world, it's very, very different than us. These people, when they get backed into a corner, they turn into wild animals. And they know how to fight. They don't give up. They don't give up. And they're tenacious. They have a whole different level of fight in them. The thing either he didn't remember or he didn't know and realize was not only was he attacking these people from this part of the world that didn't give up and didn't know how to give up, he was attacking the children of God, who had the God of all creation on their side. And when he came to them and he attacked them, he was going to get a people who would stiffen up their necks, not against God, but for God this time. And God would have their back. And God would cause a miracle to happen. And this is the thing about peoples throughout time. When it comes to Israel, they keep forgetting who they're dealing with. They have overcome superior military forces for millennia. Constantly, even into the modern times. They have constantly overcome superior forces. Would it not make sense that this little bitty country surrounded by so many hundreds of millions of enemies? I believe there's only 15 million Jews in Israel, if that. Maybe it's only 13 million in Israel. 15 in the world, but 13 in Israel. It's a tiny number of people, and there are hundreds of millions of Islamic Palestinians right in their neighborhood, within just a few hundred miles of them. All around them, they're surrounded by people who hate them. Why haven't these people just walked in and walked over them? Well, because the U.S. has stood with them. No, because Putin jumped in and jumped all over Ukraine. Right? We've seen other times where people have jumped in and done this stuff. Why haven't they? It's not because they're afraid of them. These people know. These people have a history of attacking this little country. They'll shoot their rockets and do their stuff, but they know. You want to start up a full-blown warfare against these guys? You're not just going to fight them and maybe the Americans. You're going to fight God. And that is a great deterrent to these far superior military countries to come against these guys. Do you know what would happen if Jordan and Syria and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and blah, blah, pick all of these guys, Iran, Iraq, and all of them, got together, pooled all of their resources, and just threw everything they had at Israel? From a human standpoint, it's annihilation. It's a 72-hour war and it's all over with, from a human standpoint. If America rose up against Israel, from a human standpoint, it is a bing, bang, boom, done. There's no way. They don't have the numbers. They don't have the technology. Even as great as their technology is, they don't have the ability to thwart an onslaught like that in themselves. But they're protected by God. They're protected by God. And whether the people want to admit it or not, they know it. There is a reason that little strip of dirt between the Jordan and the Mediterranean still says Israel on it, even though they try to take bits and pieces of it. There's a reason it still says Israel. And it's not because people are afraid of Israelis, it's because they're afraid of God. They don't want to admit it, but that's the truth of the matter. because there's not enough of Jews to be afraid of. They don't have enough planes and tanks to be afraid of. But they've got God. They've got God. And he still protects them. Let's see that in Armageddon. Absolutely. So it's this massive understanding that we must have. So seeing God's hand of protection, seeing God's hand of deliverance, all of this stuff, and the rededication of the temple makes Hanukkah a very, very special and important biblical feast day. Okay? Not just something that's made up. Just because it's not included in the Mosaic feast days does not mean that it is not biblical. Okay? All right. Any questions? All right. Next week we'll talk about Purim, and then we will discuss where to go from there. So if you have ideas, thoughts about where you'd like to go after this, think about it this week, and next week we'll talk about it a little bit. Well, over the next year or so, yeah. We could, yeah, he said, could we get all three of those suggestions? Yeah, we could. But if the Book of John thing is a little bit awkward, because if we did the Book of John, then we went back and did those 4 chapters and did them in depth, it would be a little bit weird. So I don't know how we would do that. Unless we decided we were just going to set aside a whole bunch of time in the middle of the Book of John to go through those and sit on them for a while. I mean, we could do that too. So think about that. We'll talk about that next week. All right, let's be dismissed in prayer. Father, we thank you once again for your love and your grace and mercy. We thank you for your deliverance, your suppliance. We pray today that we can have the hearts of Hanukkah or dedication before you in all things that we are and all things that we do. Father, I pray for the situations going on in our world, in our families, and our friends today. Touch their hearts, touch their lives. Give them full comfort and peace. Wrap your arms of love and care around them, Father, whether it's sickness, whether it's heart sickness, whether it's family sickness, whether it's death. Father, we know you're the Lord of all things, and we pray that you just minister to them all. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.